town, Pennsylvania. And at the age of 2, moved to Lancaster County, a small town called Ephrata, Pennsylvania, which is kind of a farming community, which is where the Pennsylvania Dutch and the Mennonites and that culture predominates, I guess.
We had a fairly solid upbringing. We were taught the difference between right and wrong. We were expected to do certain things. My father expected us to maintain a certain level of discipline around the house.
My mother never had any formal education. Worked at various jobs throughout her life. My mother had been married previously to a man who got killed in a car accident or something. My dad's been a truck driver all his life. Never had any formal education either.
I mean, he was a tough-minded individualist who always seemed to find it easy to stand up for what he believed in. In fact, at times reveled in it. Not that his was a crusading spirit, but he was not averse to a fight. And from time to time, he would even boast about his integrity and strength of conviction, which had a way of irritating some of the, what I refer to as weak-willed, namby-pamby types around us. My brother Ray and I responded very strongly to my father's self-esteem, which resulted in our becoming staunch individualists. I can remember a number of occasions when people referred to the Mentzers, my father, my brother, and I, as arrogant and conceited, which only served at the time to fuel my nascent individualism. Actually, we were not arrogant or conceited. We were just proud of ourselves. My father, who, while not an intellectual, learned something about the value of knowledge in the course of his life and sought to inculcate that value in me. I can remember he would reward me when I did well in school. He would give me money or gifts. I remember one time he gave me a $20 bill, and another occasion he gave me a baseball mitt. Those helped to encourage my continued hard study and doing well in school. My father, again, was always proud of the good marks that I got in school. He would brag about me to his friends and other relatives. That's bound to have a strong impact on a young kid's mind. The other influences were a few teachers who were intelligent and benevolent enough to identify the fact that I had a good mind. The effect that my father and these specific teachers had on me by applauding my mind was the greatest childhood influence I had in looking back, without a doubt.
I was never considered a bookworm as a youngster. As I got a little bit older in my teens, I started becoming more bookish, but never the typical bookworm type, I don't think. I don't recall ever being called a bookworm. I started to read a lot and continue to read as often as I can.
I was very athletic. As a matter of fact, I played some junior high school football very well. Did well in track. I did extremely well in swimming. I was the physical fitness champion of our high school 4 or 5 years in a row. I was always out in the backyard doing push-ups, sit-ups, jumping fences, climbing trees. And I enjoyed all that stuff, but all of that changed immediately when I discovered bodybuilding.
Well, it's one of those proverbial, often heard stories in bodybuilding. I was at a drugstore with my mother in my hometown of Ephrata, Pennsylvania, and while she was off doing some shopping, I was looking over the magazines, and all of a sudden my attention was arrested by the sight of a muscle man. And I knew instantly, there was no lag time, this is what I was going to be, and it was a love affair, and I've been doing it ever since.
Well, my dad bought me a set of weights. It was all I had access to for a while. And I trained by myself for, perhaps a year or two. Was making noticeable progress by the ages of 14 and 15. a matter of fact, I had some photographs taken at around that time. Maybe I was 16. And I was already looking like a well-developed advanced bodybuilder without steroids. That's when I knew. I can remember I was very impressed at one point by how my development was proceeding, and I thought, geez, I'm really starting to look like those guys. There's no reason why I shouldn't continue. All I have to do is make the commitment, and I'll do it. I didn't know anything about genetics at the time. Probably other young men can have that same notion, but not being genetically well endowed, they don't make it. But it just so happened that I did. As my father saw my continued interest, my interest continuing, he suggested I meet one of his lifelong buddies, a guy that he was very close with in his teenage years. This man named John Myers, and I was invited to train with him 3 times a week, along with his training partner and friend, a man named Russell Herzog. Russell was primarily an Olympic weightlifter and John a powerlifter, so they had a big influence on my early training. So they encouraged me to train heavily, not just in bodybuilding, but Olympic lifting and powerlifting. I like both of those. I consider myself, and looking back, not just a bodybuilder, but a strength athlete. Actually, I continued training with them for several years. John was good enough in 1965 to bring me to New York City from my hometown in Pennsylvania to compete in the first Mr. Olympia contest. I was very fortunate. I got to see Larry Scott with the first Mr. Olympia. That had an enormous impact. I can remember that serving to fuel my ambition to go further. I can recall watching Larry Scott arrive and people going literally crazy. Seeing Larry Scott was almost a religious experience. I remember after the contest, I was determined to get backstage and see him, so I climbed up a fire escape, and lo and behold, I ended up walking right into the dressing room where Larry Scott and Dave Draper were, and I stood there gawking while he wiped the oil off of his enormous arms. I clearly recall being even more impressed by his calves. I had never seen a professional bodybuilder before. Seeing his calves from behind while he was drying the oil, I got so excited I couldn't contain myself. Larry was quite friendly, and then as he was leaving, the guards ushered everybody out. I had to go down the elevator with he and Dave Draper, and that was exciting too. And then upon leaving, there were still people outside waiting, and I got that impression again as to how exciting it must be to have fans waiting for you as you're leaving the hall. As a matter of fact, I can remember sitting down with Muscle Builder, because that was the IFBB magazine, and deciding to go into the IFBB at some point because that's where the Mr. Olympia was. I can recall taking a pen, and on one of the pages inside the Muscle magazine, writing down Mr. America, underneath that Mr. Universe, underneath that Mr. Olympia. And I had placed next to each of those titles, I wrote down the year that I planned on winning them. I may have been 14 at the time. I don't recall the year, but it was the Mr. Lancaster County contest. I lived in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. They had their annual contest. It was my first contest, and I won rather handily. I had beaten some of the guys from the city who I used to look up to, and there were quite a few good bodybuilders in that area. Yeah, I must have been about 18. A year after that, at the age of 19, I went into the state contest, Mr. Pennsylvania, and won that rather easily. At that point, I was starting to look real good. When I was 19, I started using steroids. I was taking a couple of Anabol tablets a day, and it helped out quite a bit. I was training up to 3 hours a day, 6 days a week.
But at the age of 18, being young and restless and wanting to escape the dominion of my dad, went into the Air Force for 4 years, which is why I ended up in Washington, D.C. Well, at age 20, I was pretty screwed up, as many young men are. At that period, I was in the Air Force and really didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to be a doctor and a bodybuilder, but hadn't seen that much of the world and felt as though I had to have a certain amount of worldly experience before I pursued anything. I joined the Air Force to see the world and ended up in Washington, D.C., about 150 miles away from my home. So I didn't see a whole hell of a lot, but it was the big city, and I did become more worldly. I went from there to the teenage Mr. America and got second place, winning all the best body part awards.
Well, as a matter of fact, I was good enough to go into Mr. America. As a matter of fact, I did at the age of 19. 1971. That was the year that Casey Theater won. Casey won all the body part awards, best arms, best back, best legs. I got second in the best arms and best legs contest. Casey was very, very impressive. He is, I think, a couple months older than I am. But I remember being extremely impressed with him backstage at the pre-judging. All stripped down, and I saw this 19-year-old kid looking like Mr. Olympia. I went through the roof. I couldn't believe my eyes. But he was impressed by me too. Matter of fact, he approached me and told me how good he thought my genetics were. I didn't understand that term at the time. No one had spoken about it much with regard to bodybuilding. And he suggested I call his mentor, Arthur Jones. I do recall the first time I called him, he wasn't in. But he did call me back. The theory that he advanced back in the early 70s, the theory of high-intensity training, whose principles are that exercise has to be intense, brief, and infrequent, is universally valid. Right after the Mr. America contest, where I placed 10th behind Casey, I injured my right shoulder rather severely during a set of flat bench dumbbell 5. I could not train for almost 8 months after that. I couldn't raise my arm from my side, in fact. During that 8 months of inactivity, I became disheartened, a little bit depressed about it all. Didn't know how to direct my efforts elsewhere. Ended up getting not fat, but more overweight than I should have.
And after the Air Force, I stayed there for 3 more years, really kind of floating about aimlessly, not knowing quite what I wanted to do. I had gone into school, so I went to Prince George's County Community College for a while, which is where I met Catherine, by the way, in a philosophy class. And went to the University of Maryland for a while in the pre-med program, but there was still this thing in my mind about bodybuilding. I had to get that out of the way first.
And then finally in 1974, it became evident that bodybuilding was starting to take off as a popular sport, with Arnold's success and then pumping iron. And I knew I wanted to make it, so I put my foot down. I said, look, I don't want to end up 50 or 60 years old and look back and say, well, gee, I could have done that, but I didn't try. I decided in 1974 that I was going to go back into it.
And just for the purpose of getting back into a reasonable condition, not with the idea of competing, started training again 3 days a week, just a couple sets of body part. And in no time at all, started ballooning up and decided that perhaps it was time to start thinking about competition again.
I stayed in the Washington, D.C. area and went to school for right around 3 years. I was studying pre-med. I was taking biology, chemistry, mathematics, things that might get me into medical school. My goal at the time was to become a psychiatrist, as I had always had a fascination with the mind. I remember at that time I was reading a lot of Freud and R.D. Laing. As it turned out, I did not finish college. As a matter of fact, in part due to Joe Weider. I didn't compete in 74. No, I'm sorry, I didn't. I competed in small shows at Holyoke, Massachusetts. As a matter of fact, there was a Junior Mr. America contest I won up there. That wasn't bad, right around 190 pounds, which wasn't bad for a young bodybuilder of 5'8". That got me very excited. I thought if I could win Junior Mr. America in the ISBB, of course the next step was the Mr. America, and in fact it was. In 1975, Franco Colombo put on the Mr. America contest here in Los Angeles. I placed third behind Robbie. and Roger Callard. I came out here actually expecting to win, but upon reaching backstage and seeing Robbie Robinson swallowing real hard, I realized that I was not going to win. I didn't take it hard either. Upon seeing Robbie, I just, well, whatever happened, happened. If I didn't win, I didn't really care about second or third. I knew Robbie was going to win, and he did very handily. It was an important show, however, because that's where I met Joe Weider. I remember very clearly being backstage, pumping up before the pre-judging, and I couldn't get over the fact that Joe Weider was back there, and he seemed to spend all of his time staring at me. I was literally shocked. I thought, gee, I knew I looked good, but I didn't think I looked that good. And then he was actually very kind and gracious. He walked up to me after the contest, invited me to a photo session. That was Saturday, which was the next Monday morning, at a studio in downtown Los Angeles with Russ Warner. And he was very impressed at the photo session and invited me out to his offices the next day so I could do a series of 4 interviews with Gene Lozay. Ended up as quite a spread in Muscle Builder, several pages, lots of photos. And I spoke at length about the high-intensity training program. Even Gene, during the interview, was quite surprised that I was only training 3 to 5 sets per body part 2 days a week. And then, of course, the magazine received quite a bit of mail after that. And I kept doing articles, and the more articles I did, the more response the magazines got, the more response I got. As it turned out, one of those photos from Russ's photo session ended up on the cover of Muscle Builder. So I was ecstatic. I didn't know it was going to be on the cover. I don't think Joe told me it would be. But it did, and I remember being at the newsstand, Washington, D.C., and running home and calling Joe and thanking him for it. He invited me at that point to come out here to California permanently to live and work perhaps. But I was still in college and turned it down. I went back to Maryland and did go to school.
Very, very happy about that decision. But knew that I wanted to be the best. According to my own timetable, I had to win the next year or 2. So I trained like crazy after this Indy 5 America with my brother back in Washington. Trained very, very heavy that winter. And improved enough to not just win the contest, but totally freak out the judges and people had seen me the year before because I gained 14 pounds of muscle. And they thought I was a different human being. They didn't even recognize me. I went from being a distant third to a very easy first place win, having beaten Roger Callard on every judge's scorecard but one, and that was Arnold's. There were 9 judges, and every single judge voted for me but Arnold. Of course, Arnold was Roger's training partner. I never felt more excitement than I did the night I won the America. I guess maybe because it is the first big contest, getting over that hump. But I can remember, even before they called my name out, knowing I was going to win, I felt the emotion welling up in my chest, and I had to really keep myself from crying. It was such an exciting moment. And I remember standing on stage, being very, very aware of everything that was going on. The audience, people behind me, around me, and making a definite attempt to never forget this moment. Every impression, sight, sound, smell, everything. I still have that impressed on my mind. That exact moment, everything, feeling, it was great. But that was the beginning. Once you win the America, or at least for me it was, that's a stepping stone, a greater stimulus to continue. I went on to the 76 Mr. Universe in Montreal where Robbie won. I didn't really think I'd beat Robbie until that night. I thought I had gotten a greater audience reception and people were coming up, Lou Ferrigno, Boyer Co., and said that, hey, you could really win this thing. But in the back of my mind and in my heart, I knew that there was no way I was going to beat this guy. And not only did I think he looked better, but he was getting all the publicity. And I noticed that Ben Weider was introducing him to all the Montreal dignitaries in the audience, and he didn't even shake my hand, didn't even recognize my existence.
It was the winter of '76, January, February. I was walking, a quarter to a half mile between classes at the University of Maryland campus, and it was freezing. I didn't have any money. I was working for a doctor on the side. I had a girlfriend. I was just generally having a rough time of it. I was also becoming disheartened about the idea of becoming a psychiatrist. I was tired of being broke, so I called Joe and let him know that I was willing to come out if the invitation was still open, and it was. What I decided to do was, in June of that year, fly to Vancouver, British Columbia, to compete in the Mr. North America contest, which was going to be attended by Joe. I did very well at that contest. I was outstanding and won, and Joe was excited again. It wasn't the greatest competition in the world, but Darcy Beckles and myself and my brother and a few other top names made it respectable. On the way down to California from BC in the airplane, we spoke at length, and I decided to definitely make the trip to California. Matter of fact, I stayed there with Joe. My girlfriend was still back in Washington, D.C. We had an apartment. Went about making the arrangements to come out. Followed me a month or so later, and I ended up staying for good, and glad that I did. I had no regrets. But I remember the exact date. It was June 6, 1977, and I came to California with the intention of staying. I remember it very clearly. On getting off the plane, Joe and I were met by Ken Sprague, who was owner of Gold's Gym at that time, and he put me up for a while. And then I lived with Bill Grant for a very short period, and he was a maniac. So all this was done with the idea in mind that Joe would set up a residence for me, or get a residence for me. I ended up living for about a year or so in a building that Joe's aunt owned on Beverly Glen, West LA, which I enjoyed very much. Kathy and I had a very good year there. During the course of that year, my mail order came out and started doing very well. The lodgings were not spacious enough to accommodate the inventory, so we moved down the street. When I first moved here in June of '77, I was associate editor. I was in the office every single day. I only stayed in the office. I continued working in the office for approximately, maybe just 6 months. Once I was here, the word got out. I started receiving quite a large volume of requests for exhibitions. And because I was traveling all the time, after a certain point, Joe agreed to just let me continue writing without having to appear in the office. Joe and I got along extremely well. Many people thought that he sort of looked upon me as a son that he never had. He was quite happy to be around me, and even proud. He would invite Kathy and I out to dinner, up to 2 times a week. He would invite me over to his residence on weekends, and we would go to his library and talk about philosophy and art. So I was very fond of him.
And then in '77, of course, was much worse because I lost to Cal Scalak, having been designated the favorite that year. But even that didn't bother me so bad. I've never taken defeat that bad. Cal was in very, very good shape, where I was definitely off, not quite at my peak. I've never been devastated by a defeat. I don't view defeat as failure. It's just one step in the learning process. If I lose a contest, as long as it's not due to political reasons, then I analyze the situation. I analyze my physique, my performance, try to improve upon it for the next time. but I don't feel as though I've been lessened or diminished in stature as a person because I lost to Cal Scalak. Or all these guys are great champions, and losing to them is no big deal. But then having lost the 77 universe, I realized I better get my act together or forget about making a career of bodybuilding, and came back in 78 and won with a perfect score.
I knew that I had to win the 78 universe or kiss it goodbye, so I trained very, very hard for the 78 universe. Fortunately, did win that one with the first and only perfect score in history. In terms of personal satisfaction and elation, it was not what winning the Mr. America was. Winning the Mr. America involved a sense of achievement and triumph that nothing else after even came close to. I was glad to have won the universe, of course, especially with a 300 perfect score, but it was anticlimactic. There was a point where I was thinking, what did I go through all of that for?
I know a lot of people, it seems like the bodybuilding era is starting to pick up more in the last, say, 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, I think so.
And a lot of these athletes, men and women, come from different sports. Do you consider bodybuilders to be athletes, or would you consider the sport more of a discipline?
Well, I think all sports involve discipline. It depends upon how you define sport. The fact that you have all these men around the world engaged in serious physical training, which will eventually culminate in the pursuit of a competitive goal, I think it's a sport.
Having just won the 78 universe, my picture was appearing on the covers of magazines. I was appearing on national TV shows like Merv Griffin, getting a lot of publicity. I was making a lot of money. That was the high point, without a doubt. In fact, the 1979 Southern Professional Cup, that was my first professional contest. I went there in top physical condition and also mental condition. I went there feeling the way I had felt for the 76 America. I knew that I was in my best shape and it would take a monster to beat me. Prior to the prejudging, backstage, when we were all stripping down, the one guy I knew that I had to worry about was Robbie. When I saw him strip down, I knew it again, just as I knew down all the way to my toenails that I was going to win the America. I looked at Robbie and I thought, there's no way this guy's going to beat me. I was very happy, too, because I was experimenting immediately prior to that for the first time with rest pause training. And it worked. I had cut my workouts back to only 7 sets. That was one of my most heavily muscled conditions. I remember my muscles even feeling heavier. I just felt heavily muscled, and more heavily muscled at that contest than at any other contest. And I was almost as ripped as I was at the 80 Olympia. I was very big and very hard. I thought I deserved to win, and I did, and I was very happy about that. A month or two after that, there was a professional contest in Pittsburgh, which I lost to Robbie Robinson. Actually, I had won the prejudging. During the prejudging, I was in the best condition of my life. But after the prejudging, I made the mistake of going out and eating indiscriminately. At that point, I didn't understand diet and fluid intake as well as I was to later. I learned about it in part from the mistakes that I made after the prejudging of that contest. During the prejudging, I was absolutely enormous. My muscles were filled to the brim with glycogen, and my skin was extremely tight, adhering to the muscles almost like cellophane. I remember being impressed for the first time with my pecs, looking down at them under the light backstage, seeing deep striations. I thought, my goodness, I'm even better now than I was at the last show, and I was better at the last show than I was at the universe, so everything's going well. Then I made the mistake. I remember going out right after the prejudging and eating 4 or 5 pancakes, butter and syrup, drinking several glasses of orange juice, and then going to the final show that night and being clearly aware of myself that something was not as it had been that morning. I was quite disappointed, and I was afraid it would cost me the show, and ultimately it did. I had won the prejudging with a perfect score there, too. I was ahead of Robbie Robinson, and I knew it. Robbie seemed disheartened. That night, enough to piss anybody to go to Robbie. although there wasn't a contest after that Pittsburgh show, there was a contest in New York a month later, the 79 Night of Champions. At that show, I was third place behind Robbie Robinson and Danny DeVille, and I deserved it. It was right around that time that my mother became very ill, and that particular stress, on top of the stress of having just trained so hard for 3 shows in a row in a short period of time, left my motivation flagging, and I didn't even think about winning that show. I had a contractual arrangement with the people that put it on, and I went there for that reason, not to win, not thinking that I would or even cared. My mother's terminal illness was upmost in my mind. I can remember, as a matter of fact, while in New York, the night prior to the show, I received some very bad news from the doctor, and Kathy was there and was kind enough to help keep my emotions under control. But I went ahead and performed in the contest. Got third place, which wasn't bad. She ended up dying 2 weeks after that contest, and that hurt me very much because right at that point in my life where I was becoming successful and had the money to give her to travel with me, perhaps to Europe, I wanted very much for her to leave our hometown, at least for a while, and come out to California, perhaps travel. She didn't live long enough. That hurt very much. I went into quite a bit of a depression and stopped training actually for about 6 weeks, during which time I ate way too much and put on way too much fat. I lost almost all of my motivation. It was towards the end of June, 6 weeks later, 6 weeks after the New York contest, I finally decided if I was going to go into 79 Olympia, I better pull myself out of that rut. I was in the worst condition I had been in years. I was barely looking like a bodybuilder. I was flat. I had lost considerable size. There was not even a hint of abdominal definition. So I went through my mental gymnastics. I started revving myself up, whipping myself up into a lather. Finally became very tenacious, put my foot down, went on a diet, started hard training for the Olympia, which I think was in October of that year. I whipped myself into pretty good shape, although I can recall very clearly, this is an interesting one. 3 weeks before the contest, my brother Ray looked at me and said, "Gee, Mike, you've had a rough year. Our mother died. So everybody will understand. Why don't you just put it off?" That didn't deter me, and it didn't even prompt me to think that I wouldn't make it, although it gave me a little bit more of an incentive to push. The last 3 weeks before the Olympia, I improved 300%. You can put such a quantification on it. I was training very hard up to that point, but that last 3 weeks, and this is the way it usually goes, even with most bodybuilders. The last 3 or 4 weeks, you pull out all the stops. You know that it's going to be over soon, that you can take the punishment, that you're going to give it everything you possibly can, and I did. The feeling that I had the morning that I woke up that day, I had accumulated a lot of knowledge in the preceding year about reaching a peak of condition. I learned a lot from that Pittsburgh show where I messed up the evening performance. I kept voluminous notes, and I poured over my notes over and over again, and I kept daily records. I knew how to watch for patterns in my weight gains and body water levels. I worked all that out, and I knew I'd be ready for the 79 Olympia, and it worked out. My idea was confirmed. I woke up that morning. Everything that I thought would work, did work, and I was in the best condition of my life. There was no subcutaneous fat, or at least it was so little it was negligible. I did get in the best shape of my life. I went into that 79 Olympia knowing that I was as big as I'd ever been, but considerably harder. I thought even at that point that I could beat Frank Zane. I thought that my shape and proportions were equal of his, and that I would be considerably bigger. There's no reason why I shouldn't beat him. And I almost did. I did win the prejudging with another perfect score. Won my weight class, placed a very close second to Frank Zane overall. I thought, if they want more definition, then I'll get even more ripped than I was the year before. So I paid more attention to diet all year long, which is something I hadn't done before. I usually waited to start dieting 10 or 12 weeks before a show. I started dieting and doing a aerobics in February of that year, and I think the contest was in October. I carried my purpose, my goal around with me 24 hours a day from 1980. I can remember, no matter what it was I was doing, taking the garbage out, going to the post office. Everything I did had a heightened sense of meaning because I was constantly thinking about that 80 Olympia. What could I do today in terms of diet, training, aerobics, motivation to improve myself? In addition to heavy training, I was doing a lot of bike riding and even running. And then at different points, a lot of posing. I was physically active almost all day long, and everything that I did was marshaled onto the side of improvement. And I probably even at a couple points pushed myself too hard. I remember 3 times before that 80 Olympia, something a lot of people don't know. I pushed myself to the point where I literally did almost die, but I thought I was going to die. I had drained not just my glycogen levels, also my ATP. When I woke up in the morning, 3 different occasions, each separated by several weeks of leave, when I literally thought that I had done some irreparable damage to my body, I remember literally not being able to lift my arm without being left breathless. That I had pushed myself past the point probably very few human beings have ever done. I placed too much value on winning that contest. That was in Sydney, Australia, in 1980. I remember most clearly speaking with Jacques Blomart the day before the show at Paul Grant's gym. He was very concerned. He was concerned that his friend Arnold was going to destroy his legend. He was very, very concerned as his friend's concerned. He told me that, in fact, Arnold told him he was going to go on the show and how he tried to talk him out of it. So it didn't bother me to hear that he was going to go on the show, especially in lesser condition. But even if he had been in good condition, it wouldn't bother me. The morning of the show, the atmosphere was much different. There was a tension there. There was a hostility and negativity that skewed everyone's normal perception and, of course, prevented anyone from deriving the pleasure they might have had otherwise. Everything was askew at this point. It was not a normal contest. No one was talking or acting as the way they usually do. There was a strain and tension in the air all the way through. Then the issue of the weight classes came up, and there was a lot of arguing going on between Arnold and a few of the guys. I wasn't even concerned about that. I didn't care one way or the other. I thought I could win. It was a very large room. There must have been maybe 50 or 60 people in there, and Arnold, as usual, wanted to be the center of attention. But he had said something to denigrate Samir Badu in front of everyone, something that was uncalled for. He was making a fool out of himself, but at that time I wasn't concerned. I thought if Samir Badu wanted to defend himself, that was his business. So he was going through his antics. At one point, Boyer Coe stood up as a gentleman and said, look, why don't we just let Arnold explain to all of us right here, right now, what his reasons are for wanting to have his weight class, and maybe we can get to the bottom of this instead of arguing aimlessly. And he did say it in a very gentlemanly fashion. There was no hint of malice or anything negative in his voice. And Arnold snapped back, oh Boyer, why don't you stop acting like a baby, grow up and be a man, which I thought was uncalled for. So I said, look, Boyer Coe said that as a gentleman, something to that effect. He doesn't deserve that. You just accused Boyer of acting like a baby when in fact you're the one who's acting worse than that. And that pissed him off. He turned and he said, oh, come on, Mentzer, we all know that you lost last year because of this big selling. And I allowed that to irritate me perhaps too much, and on impulse I ran over toward him. I scared him. Arnold Schwarzenegger sat down. I continued at him. I was wagging my finger at him, telling him that his behavior was reprehensible, that it was not Boyer Coe who needed to grow up again. Only once I stood up at the pre-judging meeting did that thing come to at least a partial halt. That irritated Ben Weider, and he stood in between Arnold and I and tried to assert himself. But it became very clear, especially later on as the day proceeded, that things weren't the way they should be. In 1980, I placed 5th at the Mr. Olympia, a contest that I and almost everyone else who witnessed it was convinced was fixed.
Well, my immediate gut level reaction was paradoxical as it may sound, was laughter. I just started laughing. It was ludicrous to me. It was so obviously an incorrect decision that my first response was just to laugh.
It's interesting, at the 1980 Olympia, the only people who saw Arnold as the winner were the 7 judges and his closest friends. None of the other competitors saw him as the winner. None of the audience, or very few, only those that were his friends. If it was just me saying this, of course it could be chalked up to sour grapes, although that's not true. I've lost contests before, I never raised a fuss. But that particular contest was so clearly fixed that every other competitor and many of the fans in the audience raised a fuss. And of course, in the aftermath, all the magazines carried articles pertaining to the fact that it was fixed, and as a result decided to drop out of competitive bodybuilding.